AI industry picks its own tests, right? It's like you telling me that you grade your own papers. Retrofitting ethics into a system that is already there is like putting seatbelts after the car is already going in 90 miles per hour. No algorithm should be the final word on whether it is a family that qualifies for humanitarian assistance. When someone asks, where did this information come from or where did this number come from, to resist the temptation to build a grand, unified data architecture on day one. What we see as a foundational thing that nobody wants to talk about.
Hi everyone, thanks for listening to another episode of Data Innovators and Builders. Today I'm speaking with Anusha Dandapani, Chief Data and AI at United Nations International Computing Center, UNICC. Anusha, thanks for chatting with me today.
It's my pleasure. Thank you, Saket, for having me.
So Anusha, let's start off with a little bit about your background and your role at UNICC.
Sure. My role at UNICC is I initially started this practice at UNICC. I started with UNICC in 2020, and in my role, my mandate was to lead the data and AI practice. In 2025, UNICC we launched the UNICC AI Hub, which is a centralized resource for AI related initiatives across the UN system. And in my role, I focus on coordination across the board within the UN wide initiatives such as AI governance, development, responsible deployment of AI, and very much focused on delivery of shared solutions that are aligned with the UN mandates. Yeah. And previously, I used to work for financial services. Prior to joining UNICC, I served as the data science lead at Barclays and very much focused on regulatory environment and delivering end-to-end data science solutions. And I'm also an adjunct professor at each boards in data visualization and visual analytics at Fordham, and that is one of my passion that I focus on.
It's incredible background, Anusha, and it's a pleasure talking to you. So, you talked about the role at UNICC and how it connects across the different parts of the organization, right? So, when you are building these AI systems that are operating in such critical areas, what keeps you up at night?
That's honestly, I would say it's not the technology that keeps me up. I think what it keeps me up is actually the asymmetry of consequences. Yeah. What I mean by that is, see, when commercial AI perhaps makes a wrong recommendation and someone loses money, it's a very different kind of a scenario to respond or handle. But however, if in a humanitarian context, uh, if someone loses the aid or somebody who is sort of not given um, the right information at the right time, um, especially in a context like ours, the demands are completely different. And the relationship with uncertainty of us uh, dealing with this kind of information is also very different. So I'm not losing my sleep over these models and this AI would be correctly. I'm only losing my sleep actually over uh, whether every failure that we might have does it have a human consequence. Yeah. So because a failure is sometimes it's not rarely addressed and it's mostly technical. So there is also the consequence of organizational, political, and cultural context. So that's what keeps me up.
It's a high stakes role, and clearly, because of the impact, AI safety is top of mind for you. So I think compared to the industry, as you said, we are all about experimenting, moving quickly, and AI is just moving at such a fast pace. But you are keeping safety top of mind. Tell us a little bit about your approach, to that.
See, sometimes in the context of where we are, um, there isn't not many safety evaluation frameworks, or there isn't sort of methodologies to systematically address the safety, right? Like, for example, when we were discussing, I did mention to you that how do you make sure safety across contexts of multilingual situations that we are dealing with? Like, for example, AI models are built for English, but we are focusing on deploying it everywhere. So, if AI models only reliably work in English, how can we deploy it in the context of Spanish or Arabic or uh, in another context of French? We do see that the performance degrades, yeah, because it's not because of those models are not performing well. It's because the training data for those languages were thin or perhaps fragmented or even absent in this context, right? So for multilateral organizations like ours, where we are operating across the globe and beyond, this is very important that safety is critical. Hallucination resistance, trying to identify if we have evaluated the model per language, not of just English. Those are some of the questions or the research questions that we are done with.
I see. So, organizationally speaking, then what does the structure or the team look like in approaching some of these? Is it more humans in the loop? Is this your own team sort of testing, evaluating the models? Like, how do you approach this?
So right now, what we are trying to achieve is by creating what we call as retina, a small team which is currently focused on identifying those scenarios that are relevant to us and run the scenarios that we can actually validate, um, either with the RAG system and with the kind of benchmarks that we already have. So essentially, we have an audit method baked by not only bringing in engineers from our team, but also the data scientists and the research collaborations that we have with academia. So that is more or less the structure of how we are um, currently contextualizing AI safety, and also very much testing these AI models with UN data sets in mind.
I see. Okay. And in your case, you are dealing with a lot more data fragmentation that we would see in the industry, right? So, this is data across different organizations. So, how are you thinking about data interoperability that maybe we can learn from as an approach?
See, dozens of organizations, they do have this complexity. Yeah. So one thing that worked very well so far in my context is we don't boil the ocean first. Yeah. So the thing that we thought is also to resist the temptation to build a grand unified data architecture on day one. Yeah. Because sometimes uh, that's how the projects usually die, creating committees. Instead, what made more sense for us is to actually find that minimum viable interoperability layer, or like a small shared um, vocabulary or a small shared use case, at least two organizations exchange meaningfully, right? And that way, we are not abandoning what we build. So I think we start there and we prove that value. And the complexity, it doesn't disappear because we are dealing with two organizations. It just becomes manageable. Yeah. So we are essentially having real stakeholders rather than abstracting these data sets or the data silos that these organizations have, right? Like, dealing with it in a sort of an interoperability layer first made more sense for us.
Hmm. So yeah, I mean, I think that's a very pragmatic approach, and especially you come from like a large bank, for example, and sometimes large organizations have huge amount of resources, and they're like, hey, we can take on the entire problem, but it's better to be saying that, hey, we have maybe a set of resources that we can work with and go point at one problem rather than take too much on, right? So sometimes that's a good thing. F- to be focused from that perspective, right? So um now you, I mean, you are using these foundational models, for example, and solving some of these use cases. I think it would be really helpful if you might be able to share a couple of examples that we can relate to from an outside perspective, that you have seen success with.
Um, some of the use cases that we have tackled that we can definitely share is one of the initiative that we built as a shared AI platform for our HR community colleagues in collaboration with some of our UN partners. Um, our role was to be the technical implementation organization. And what we learned of implementing that use case, especially for the context of HR, especially to use AI to identify uh, information from policy documents. It is called the Unify HR. That was one of the shared infrastructure, not only a shared infrastructure solution that we built where participating organizations uh, not only shared the data, but we were able to tackle this problem from total cost of ownership, what we call as the frugal approach of how can we do more with less approach in this use case. So because it was a cooperative solution that we built as a shared solution across the board between multiple organizations, the contribution that these organizations made was not only taken, but also the cost of the solution was divided by the number of participating organizations. That helped us um, focus on solving the problem itself and not worrying about the cost of uh, owning a solution per organization. And second, it also helps us avoid the duplicity of creating the same solution in multiple shapes and forms across the organizations. Yeah, like, these 10 organizations, imagine they ended up building the same AI solution for the same workflow. It would have created a duplicity of solutions in the enterprise platforms, right? And the third aspect that we tackled in this successful use case is the concept of co-testing. So because we had 10 organizations participated, they were able to share the test scenarios. And it was not just benchmarking on just the model performance, it was also the prompt engineering, the jailbreaking, the red teaming. So it was a very helpful um, AI use case that we implemented 2 years ago. It's in production plus 18 months. Sato.
So one of the things you've talked about is sort of thinking about responsible AI from day one, and that may not necessarily happen in um, commercial settings. But just curious, how do you approach that? How do you lay down the framework of that responsible AI, and you know uh, why is trying to do that later on or bolting it later not the right approach?
Yeah. See, because retrofitting ethics into a system that is already there, it's like putting seat belts after the car is already going in 90 miles per hour situation. Yeah. So, uh, see, architectural decisions which we make needs to be made at the design level or in the first few weeks of when the initiative or the project actually starts. Because what we care about more when it comes to responsible AI is what data do you use? What are the proxy variables that we usually allow? And how comfortable are we with that? And then what model is actually optimizing those decisions for us, especially when it comes to the ethics of our system. So whether you acknowledge it or not, um, the time we bring that responsible AI review, um, if it is done 6 months later, we are not really auditing these systems for the choices that the systems will make. Yeah, so you cannot remove some decisions that the system will take. So what we do is, like, organizations that do it backwards aren't actually being irresponsible. But what I'm saying is that they don't realize that the technical decision that you already take when it comes to responsible AI is already a values decision that you have to bake in when you're designing the architecture of these systems.
And I think the question of responsible AI has become to some extent mainstream, and there are some model providers. For example, we have seen Claude talk a lot about that, right? Um, and as the impact of AI is increasing, that becomes more critical. Now, how do you see at least the industry is sort of evolving towards some of these goals that perhaps you were focused on, but now to what extent are they catching up?
I think responsibility goes in hand um, in systems that we build across the board, across multiple enterprises. We are a shared services organization. So when we across the board engage with multiple enterprises, what we see is more uh, a priority for us is to build a trust, the trust in AI systems, especially when we are working across multiple jurisdictions, multiple environments, and then also some instances where um, the AI systems that we are deploying um, are also reliable, because sometimes in the low stake decision environment, um, we don't sort of take it easy. We also make sure that the level of acceptability that we agree to even deploying these things um, uh, beyond performance is trust. Yeah, so we do risk monitoring, we do risk assessment. We make sure that we are not deploying black box models in the context of decision making. So, acceptability of what we accept varies enormously, but we do invest heavily in making sure that the trust and validating these AI systems is important to us.
And you are working obviously with different stakeholders with different objectives, right? Um, how do you manage that, and what lessons can we take from that?
That's a very valid question, because what we see when we are engaging with multi-stakeholder contexts like ours, where the stakeholders are not the same, but when we are um, engaging with these stakeholders, our role as the technical advisory or the implementing organization um, is to make sure what are those non-negotiables that we are making sure our stakeholders are aware, and it's like holding their hand in their journey when we are not only assisting them with the well tested solution, but also to see that the stakeholders have enough sort of confidence when they're operating these AI systems. Because sometimes when we hand off these technical solutions, um, we make sure that we serve them with independent audit, and giving them the assurance that the system that we have built um, is not something built by someone outside the system, or sometimes somebody who's outside the UN context, right? So that is a helpful uh, process that we very much focus on as a shared services organization. But also, we do care about making sure that speed is of essence, but also clearly building things that can be off ramped when we need to be off ramping these solutions. Because sometimes the, the agile way of working, or giving them the bite sized options is something that we do focus on that helps us build trust with our multi-stakeholder engagements. Yeah.
And what does rollout look like from initial idea to a prototype to when you scale to production? And it seems like along the way you're also educating and building trust with your stakeholders, right?
Hmm.
So how do you plan that sort of rollout and how do you execute that?
See, in rolling out solutions in a context like ours, what we see is a very important factor. Um, it's very easy to pilot. Everybody wants to pilot with AI. But what we see makes more sense is the last mile journey of pilot to production. Yeah, most organizations um, sort of miss that workflows of what makes more sense to scale from a pilot, right? Um, what we also care about when it comes to piloting these AI use cases or putting things in production, what does it look like is we make sure that with the institutional knowledge that we have, we technically validate these systems to be production ready. And second, we also care for when we are deploying these systems, are they designed for the user community correctly? And that comes with one of the key factor that we have learned by doing or we have learned by deploying in context of change management. That's a period, yeah. Because technology can work very well in different contexts, but if the organizational immune system rejects it because it hasn't integrated it or it hasn't accepted it, that's where the change management becomes a very important context when it comes to how we do things and deploy things in production. So that is one of the things that we have learned uh, in an enterprise context like ours.
Okay. And what might be a key bottleneck that you see in that sort of last mile of going to production? Is there like a um, way to sort of say, okay, now that we have hit this sort of level, it's ready for production, or are there some sort of litmus test you would do?
Yes, so we do what we call as security assessments, especially the cybersecurity layer. That is most important thing. That unless we get the clearance from our security team and the risks that they would highlight are uh, responded to. That is one thing. And second is there is a regulatory landscape context where we are deploying it into user population where there is sensitive data involved. Um, we want to make sure that um, we are maintaining all the controls, the active controls that we need to keep in mind. So those are a couple of things that we do ongoing, regardless of AI solution or not. And the second thing we definitely do is monitoring them because one thing is to create and deploy. If you cannot maintain and sustain them in production environments, the value or the return on investment on these solutions in the long run is not valuable because in 18 months from now, if the nice system that we built stops working, um, it is not going to be um, a return on investment for the organization.
Yeah, and especially with generative AI, I think the quality of models and how they perform, but also how they behave, has been evolving quite rapidly, right?
Mhm.
As have been the approaches, from RAG to more agentic solutions, right? So there's a constant, I guess, evaluation and enhancement, right? Um, so let's talk a little bit about the foundation side, Anusha. So from a
Mhm.
data foundation perspective,
Mhm.
um, what sort of creates that solid foundation to build the AI on? You said early on that the goal was not to take it all in, but kind of focus on a use case and stay on that. But what foundational pieces did you have to put together, or maybe you already had in place?
See, perhaps I'm going to mention something which is a uh, unsexy thing, right? Um, that you were pointing out, because what we see as a foundational thing that nobody wants to talk about is data lineage, uh, because nobody wants to fund it, and everybody assumes that someone else has done it. Because the moment you're in a high stakes um, meeting, or even someone asks, where did this information come from, or where did this number come from, and you cannot answer this with confidence, your entire AI system loses its credibility. Like in our context, this is even more acute because sometimes when you often pull data from different instances or different applications or different partner organization feeds, um, if you don't know the provenance of your input, you cannot defend the integrity of your outputs, right? So, especially in production environments, you will always be asked to defend them. So, data lineage is a foundational thing. Yes.
Yeah, and data lineage is one of the harder problems to solve, actually, right? And especially in your case, as you deal with both sort of sensitive data and data from different organizations, also, right? So it becomes that much harder to um, build a system where you have clean confidence on, like, okay, if I'm doing this one, I'm using data that should be used, the right sort of governance is applied, and we're not sort of uh, yeah. Is there an approach that has worked, or are there tools that you would recommend to us in terms of solving this problem?
Um, most organizations um, usually have what they call as a governance framework that is must be considered at a design input level itself. Um, but the real practical impact of organizations relying on tools to tackle these problems versus actually focusing on how the mapping is within an organization with a governance framework, a governance model card, um, with sort of things that are baked in that the AI system can readily adopt to architecturally. That is what I would recommend to consider, because first class architecture is that aligns with the governance framework that is in the context of the organization, um, will make the decision very easy, not only for your technical teams, but also will help you with the rollback plan, or if there is an escalation plan you need to put together, right? So, um, it's not a tool based problem that is a solution. It's more of how you are designing it architecturally for the context of your organization.
Okay. Um, One thing I was curious, right? I mean, as we have been evolving the approaches within AI from more RAG related approaches to answer questions to more agentic approaches where we want agents to take actions as well. And how do you sort of view that, especially when it comes to agents taking actions part of the flow, which is kind of the big thing we're talking about in enterprises? How can specific workflows be automated, either partially or fully? When you look from your perspective, you know, what would your guidance be, especially in high stakes environment, right?
Um, when it comes to AI agents, I think there is this biggest misconception is that AI is a project, um, and uh, and not like a capability, right? Like, because AI agents building the possibility of automating workflows or using AI agents in automating workflows is quite different. Um, but what we see that the leaders within these organizations are, they don't approve a budget for you to have the deliverable, or how the AI system gets built, or how it gets deployed. Um, because in their mental model, this dynamic environment of using different AI agents or AI tools um, is a is a the world is a changing, and what is happening when it comes to shifts that are happening. It is not, again, going back to what I mentioned before, that it's not a tool based decision, uh, because the landscape is evolving so well that with the Gen AI and the AI agents and the new way of doing things, the organizations that succeed actually in the long term are there where is treat the AI system where they would treat an AI system like how they would treat a critical infrastructure, yeah, especially with their ongoing investment or monitoring these AI systems and things like that. So that is where I see organizations move in the next 18 months. And if the leaders who are leading these organizations look at it from an organization lens as a long term success of AI systems in their organization. Yeah. Hope I answered your question, Saket.
Yeah, yeah, I think certainly, and I want to get also a little bit into the aspect about AI replacing human
Yeah.
decision making, and maybe
Mm.
how you see that, and where do you sort of draw the line on what AI should or shouldn't do.
Yeah. See, my line is drawn around irreversibility and accountability. What I mean by that is, see, AI should handle decisions that are high volume, time sensitive, and reversible, because sometimes we are using AI for pattern detection or anomaly flagging. But if we don't get the humans to retain the authority over the decisions that are irreversible, that can carry a lot of um, accountability, right? So, see, no algorithm should be the final word on whether it is a family that qualifies for humanitarian assistance, or a person who gets flagged for a security risk, or whether a community for whom the resources are going to get allocated did not get allocated because AI cannot process this decision uh, correctly, right? Like, so some of these decisions, what we care about when it comes to hype is this concept of answerability. We have to go beyond explainability, because the answerability of these decisions, because you cannot hold these algorithms accountable, you can only hold people accountable. So AI should actually amplify our human judgment, um, and it should never launder our human responsibility.
And that becomes part of training the team as well, right? Which is using the AI tools in, because I personally feel like it becomes easy sometimes to look at a big output from AI and say, okay, that looks more or less fine, and go ahead with that. So a lot of it comes back to our own responsibility as users, also, right?
Yeah.
And that's the framework, right? So high stakes decisions that are irreversible, that require human judgment, versus maybe repetitive things that are, um, that have low impact or are at least reversible, right? So that's a good framework to think of, I would say, in general.
Mm.
um, One of the things you mentioned, right, is like the kind of decisions being made could impact individuals in a very, I mean, even if you're making it at large scale, it
Mm-hmm.
could impact individuals, in terms of their life. So, for example, an aid decision to a family, and you may be looking at maybe millions of people, but each individual decision sort of matters to that person. Um, in many of these type of processes, the context of the whole situation matters a lot, right? And we've
Yeah.
been talking a lot about context in the world of AI, and the context could very well be the person, their finance, their situation, a lot of other factors that go in. So how are you approaching the context part when you're bringing into that sort of analysis in here, because you have a diverse set of resources, I would imagine, for context, right?
Yeah. Sometimes the the term context means very different for different um, organizations. Yeah. The context that we approach, in one sense, if I were to go back to the AI use case that I was referring to, is that we focus on spending twice as long as in defining the problem, because it only takes half the time for us to select a model to solve for this problem, right? Like, the elegance of an approach is very, very easy right now, with the technology and the technical tools that's available to us. But genuinely focusing on defining the problem and you're actually solving for the right problem, um, that is what is something that makes more sense in the context of the organization, right? Like, sometimes AI can become the most expensive mistake that we are making when it comes to us choosing a solution, right? The building the right for a wrong problem is far more expensive.
Very true. I think I like your point that it starts with defining the problem and spending more time in doing that. I think that itself forces the framing of the context, and the decision making process, right? Um, so, I mean, this is I mean, you're solving some really incredible problems, and I think the approach that you're taking sounds very pragmatic to me, right? So, what would you say that is something contrarian that you believe about implementing AI, which which maybe other people in the industry might disagree with?
That is a very uh, leading question. See, I believe we are massively over investing in model sophistication, performance of a model, and actually under investing in decision architecture. What I mean by that is the AI field has this novelty or rewarding um, benchmarks, performance. Uh, but in my experience, the difference between a transformer model or a gradient boosting model is rarely what that determines the success of an AI initiative or if it fails in the initiative. What actually determines whether the organization is using the AI system is actually seeing that clearly defined decision that AI is actually supporting the user community and who has actually the authority to override it and what happens when the system goes wrong, right? So I would rather have a less sophisticated, a very small embedded model with the rigorous decision architecture instead of having a state of the art model just dropped in the space, right? See, most of my peers would call that conservative, but I call it pragmatic because I call it this pragmatic approach is what actually scales.
I think that is very well said, and I would agree that we're definitely, in many cases, going with the flow of the bigger, better model, uh, and maybe forgetting about reliable approaches that have existed, right? Um, I would love for you to double click a little bit about the decision architecture that you talk about,
Mhm.
what that means, and how we can all benefit from having that approach.
Um, so the decision architecture, what um, uh, I might frame slightly different is that see, we are no longer in this milk or the era of move fast and break things. Uh, in my opinion, it was not appropriate advice. Yeah, it happened in a consumer tech instance, because even with broken features, um, it did not impact people's life, right? Exactly. Yes. In our environment, I think the right mental model is to move. decisively but reversibly, right? Like the speed doesn't mean recklessness, it just means um, doing fewer things with much higher confidence. So building a system which can not only move very fast on a narrow, well defined problem. That's what I mean by the decision architecture of the problem, with a strong human oversight built in, right? Like, this has become a fancy thing for everybody to say human in the loop. But I would frame it as human oversight because when you move slowly, when the scope is ambiguous, the failure modes are more irreversible. So the distinction between when you're making decisions between speed, which is irreversibility, the most that's where the most organizations get into trouble of risks. So the decision making process, I would go back to the thought process of doing fewer things with much higher confidence and breaking in this as a layer in your architecture of the solutions or the AI systems that you're building um, helps enterprise organizations and on also meeting your stakeholder expectations.
So it seems like, the shift would also is like, not just sort of, instead of optimizing the model output, to also designing sort of good failure paths. So when things don't work, you know, um, how do you sort of go along that, right?
Yeah, see, sometimes I would rather have um, a less sophisticated model uh, with a very fantastic design, um, which which is still sustainable and it is available and it is running in our production environment, um, across the board, across approaching it and focusing more on scaling it than to actually having a AI solution which is uncomfortable or unclear in how ambiguous that model is, right? Like when we are feeding in our data, right? Like we touch any data that we are going to get the AI solution to work with, the system would affect many things that we are not in control of, right? The right algorithm, as I said before, right, like the right algorithm for the wrong problem is the most expensive uh, failure point that we care about.
Yeah, I mean, do you think from an approach perspective, because we talk about how these models are, better than PhDs and they can ace any test and stuff like that, that we may be sort of over-indexing and saying that the models are so capable that we as individual implementers are missing the foundations of data science or data analytics that would apply to a problem and just sort of outsourcing it to the model? Is there a sort of a risk that the approaches are sort of undermining where human analysis is being
Hmm.
sort of maybe not applied to the same extent?
See, if the AI industry picks its own tests, right, it's like you telling me that you grade your own papers, right? How do you design um, an evaluation framework or an evaluation approach that actually measures what matters to us, right? Like, in the absence, because sometimes AI developers, we selectively adopt to certain benchmarks as a de facto measure for success and things like that, right? But sometimes what we feel um, this benchmark as marketing um, is not very helpful in a context like ours because most of our operational workflows, having a benchmark audit methodology that makes more sense is genuinely covering our scenarios, uh, and it is also fixing our gaps because systematically our gaps are very different compared to the private sector benchmarks that are explicitly published as marketing um, approaches, right? Like sometimes um, we do care about more than marketing the accountability mechanisms in these benchmarks. Yeah.
I mean, I can see a very deep understanding of your organization's goals, objectives, constraints, data, and all of that sort of coming into play in how you're approaching the implementation. Do you think that is what will differentiate between organizations that end up successfully scaling AI versus being stuck in all of these experiments and pilots? That sort of clarity of understanding and awareness, is that the big difference?
Um, I think the big difference that a successful organizations um, not think this through is that the people miss that interoperability is fundamentally the most important thing. And it's not just a technical problem, and it's an organization wide problem. Because if an organization fails to share their own internal data because of lack of, say, perhaps right APIs or right formats, they fail, and they don't build the trust on how their data will be used within an organization. Yeah, and or also potentially it could be even uh, sort of weaponized against them. So um, having that interoperability, technical interoperability, and a trust-based architecture actually almost solves many of these issues that big enterprise organization usually face, because sometimes we will build this beautiful data lake, beautiful unified big information architecture that nobody actually throws their data into.
Yeah, and I've seen those happen as multi-year projects with a lot of, initial, investment and a big bang, but then the outcomes after multiple years are not there to see. And actually, for many cases, I feel like the amount of time it takes to get there, the technology has moved on, and people have moved on in their focus, right? So often they seem like half-started and unfinished initiatives, right?
Yes.
So, yeah, I think that one thing that you mentioned earlier was when it comes to lineage, like there's not oftentimes a willingness to invest. And maybe I heard it as like, look, everybody is talking about AI, the willingness to invest in the fundamentals of data quality, data lineage, data cleanliness, and even, structuring and organizing things
Mhm.
is less, although we need that for the outcome. So, what's your advice to other data leaders when they are figuring out their budgets?
Um, See, when you're determining budgets, one thing that I would suggest is, see, don't push back on the innovation, because um, I would suggest to push back on the timeline, because instead of saying our data quality isn't good enough, say based on the data that we have right now, this model will give a wrong answer approximately in 4 times. Versus what does the wrong answer look like for us in operational terms, right? Like, see, when you translate this kind of data quality into decision um, qualities risk, it stopped being a technical objection. People start understanding that, at least at the leadership level, leadership gets sort of this information, or they can make an informed choice to accept that this is a risk, right? Like, what they can't do is make this responsible choice. But when the risk is hidden inside a technical euphemism, highlighting this data quality like a data maturity challenge will actually help data leaders to negotiate.
Yeah, I think it goes back to the foundations of leadership and communicating both up and down, and sort of keeping that pragmatic approach, which goes back to where we started. Take a narrow focus area, build and show outcomes to that. You can't just be like constantly, oh, I'm just building the infrastructure and the results will come later kind of approach, right? So it's kind of keeping both together, right? So, this is fabulous, Anush, and you have really great insights into how data leaders can operate, and you are doing that at a maybe a lot more complicated scale because of just the nature of the organization you work with, and the variety of stakeholders that you deal with. But these are great lessons for, I think, everybody here. So yeah, really appreciate you sort of going into the details. To wrap up, I would love for you to maybe share what you find as good resources for people to learn and keep up with, and anything you might want to share with the audience.
Sure. Thank you for having me, Sankit. And these are the conversations that actually move uh, the field forward. So for anyone who wants to continue the dialogue, the best way to find me is on LinkedIn. I try to write regularly about sometimes the intersection of AI governance, humanitarian data, and responsible deployment, and what it actually looks like at scale. These are the topics that actually fascinate me. If you're also working in a similar challenge, I genuinely want to hear from you. So this work is too important and also too complex to figure it out all alone.
I love the mission and the impact that AI can have with the work that you are doing. So, would love to keep track and see the impact that it creates. So, thank you so much for taking the time today. Really appreciate
Thank you,
this.
Saket.
Thank you.